Nobody in that prison was ready for what was about to happen in that cafeteria. It only took one gesture, one hand tangled in someone's hair, and a silence sharp enough to cut the air for the fate of two women to shift forever. And even though it looked like just another ordinary day behind concrete and steel, something was about to break. And it wasn't going to be bones, but the very logic of fear that ruled that place. Redwall Federal Penitentiary was infamous for a lot of things. Cold hallways, guards who didn't care, rigid routines, and one unwritten rule everyone learned the moment they arrived. Show weakness and you lose. And losing there didn't just mean falling down. It meant being stepped on, literally or otherwise. In the cafeteria, the steel tables formed neat rows, and the smell of lukewarm food hung in the air. Nobody ate peacefully. Every meal was a silent negotiation, where to sit, who to look at, who to avoid. Among the dozens of women, one figure was impossible to overlook: Marla Briggs. She wasn't the tallest or the strongest, but she was the gravity of the room. Her name floated through the cell blocks like a warning. Marla didn't need to raise her voice, she just needed to exist. Across the room sat Hannah, newly arrived, strangely composed. No alliances, no reactions. While everyone else measured every move, Hannah seemed to live on a different tempo, as if the prison didn't apply to her. Her quietness drew attention, and in Redwall, attention was a dangerous currency. Marla noticed it quickly. She walked across the cafeteria with steady, deliberate steps. Some inmates watched with interest. Others quietly shifted out of the way, understanding exactly what was about to unfold. Hannah stayed seated, eyes on her plate, holding her chopsticks with a kind of gentle precision, as if she were having dinner in her own kitchen instead of a prison. That indifference was the fuse. Marla stopped behind her. She didn't speak at first, she simply watched. A dusty boot landed on the table, claiming space, and with her other hand, Marla grabbed Hannah's hair. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to announce ownership of the moment. Conversation stopped. The air froze. Hannah didn't react. She didn't try to pull away. She didn't look up. She didn't show fear. She simply exhaled, like someone watching rain fall, knowing it will pass. That kind of calm provokes more rage than screams ever could. "You deaf?" Marla finally asked, her voice low. "In here, you look at me when I talk." No reply. The silence was so thick it felt like it had weight. The entire cafeteria watched, guards, inmates. Even the distant footsteps in the corridor seemed to pause. Everyone understood. This wasn't about physical harm. This was about psychological dominance, about who bends and who refuses to. Then Marla did what everyone knew was coming. She hit Hannah with a single punch. No flourish, no dramatic brutality. It wasn't meant to injure, but to mark, to say without words, "You do not matter here." Hannah felt the impact. Her body tilted slightly. The plate rattled. A strand of hair fell across her face, but she didn't fall. She didn't raise a hand. She didn't strike back. She didn't look ashamed. She simply straightened her posture, tucked her hair behind her ear, and continued eating, while crumbs from the impact were still in the air. That was the moment the fear changed direction, because everyone expected submission, tears, anger, or at least some crack in her expression. But what appeared in Hannah's eyes was something impossible to ignore. Control. Not numbness, not defiance, pure, grounded control. And in that place, control was more dangerous than strength. Marla felt something she hadn't felt in years: hesitation. It didn't show to the others, but it was enough to stir something deep inside her. And the prison felt it too, not through words, but through the silence that followed, because when someone doesn't react to a hit, it means they know something no one else does. And in that instant, every woman in that cafeteria understood one simple truth. Marla was going to regret that punch. And it wouldn't take long. Redwall wasn't just a building wrapped in high walls and electrified fencing. It was its own ecosystem, alive, breathing, shifting, where every person played a role far beyond whatever was written in their official file. There were those who ruled, those who watched, those who followed, and most of all those who survived quietly, blending into the social shadows of that enclosed world. It was a city within walls, complete with its own rules, codes, and unspoken laws. Marla Briggs didn't become the center of that world overnight. When she first arrived years earlier, she was like any frightened inmate, trying to learn how to breathe in an environment that seemed designed to suffocate. But Redwall had no patience for weakness, and she adapted fast. She learned that power there wasn't earned through raw force. Force burns out. Real control came from something deeper: information, influence, strategic intimidation. And Marla excelled at that. Over time, she built her reputation. Every step she took was intentional. Every look had weight. Every word was a move on the board. Her followers didn't stay close only because they feared her. They believed she was the one who kept the delicate order of that place intact. And they knew one thing: removing Marla would only make room for someone far worse. That was why, when she walked into the cafeteria, the room arranged itself like a stage preparing for its lead. But on that day, something happened that even she hadn't calculated. Hana, the newcomer, didn't seem to belong to Redwall. And yet she did, in a way no one could understand. Her silence wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence of observation. Her hands were gentle, yet deliberate. Her posture was too calm for someone who had already felt the weight of sentencing. She seemed to think 2 steps ahead of everyone else, but without needing to prove it. The guards had noticed her from day one. Her file came with missing pieces, blurred details, half-redacted lines, contradictory notes. Some said she'd transferred from another state. Others whispered her case involved an ongoing federal investigation. But no one actually knew, and in Redwall, the unknown always unsettled people. In the dorms, women whispered about her after lights out, as the hallways dimmed and only the small lamp above the exit glowed. They whispered about the way she moved, efficient, economical, almost trained. They whispered about how nothing seemed to shake her. But what they whispered most was that she did not fear Marla. And that, more than anything, disrupted the balance of that place. Marla, outwardly, acted the same after the cafeteria incident. She walked as if everything had gone exactly as she intended, as if that punch was just one more item in the invisible ledger of power. But internally, something had shifted. Not because of Hana's strength. Hana hadn't shown strength, but because of her absence of reaction. It was a violation of Redwall's logic. And when logic breaks, systems tremble. During recreation hour in the yard, the usual rhythms returned. Some inmates worked out, others talked, others stared up at the slice of sky framed by razor wire. Hana walked the same path every day, gate to wall, wall to the lone tree, tree to the concrete bench, over and over. It looked like ritual, like meditation, like calculation. Marla watched from a distance. She could feel something forming, something quiet, something that didn't need to announce itself to be real. And at the same time, a question began forming inside her, one she couldn't shake. Who was Hana before Redwall? Because no one moves through fear like that without a reason. No one defies that ecosystem's pressure without a story behind them. And there was one thing Redwall always revealed, sooner or later, the truth of who you were before those doors shut. The past always finds a way in, even through walls. After the cafeteria incident, something subtle began to shift inside the prison. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't dramatic. It was like a small stone changing the course of a river. The water doesn't turn all at once, but eventually it finds a new path. And Redwall, a place built on fear as its foundation, felt its rhythm begin to tilt. Marla tried to move as though nothing had happened. She still walked with that steady, confident posture, chin lifted, shoulders relaxed. She still occupied the same spaces, issued the same silent commands, cast the same looks that made others lower their eyes. But in the small details, barely noticeable, something was wrong. Slight, almost invisible, but undeniably present. When she entered the cafeteria now, some inmates glanced at Hana before reacting to Marla, as if waiting, as if something was still undecided. Marla's power depended on two things: everyone believing in her, and her believing in herself. And in that moment, the second part had started to crack. The next morning at breakfast, Hana sat in the same seat as always. Her chopsticks moved with the same slow precision. Steam rose from her plate. Everything looked normal, as though the cafeteria hadn't been the center of Redwall's biggest tension in days. But the silence around her said everything. No one sat near her, not out of fear, but because no one knew where they stood now. Marla watched from across the room, hands behind her back, expression composed. To most, it looked like she was assessing the room as usual. But anyone who dared look closely, few ever did, would see the shadow of a question lingering in her eyes. Why didn't she fear me? Redwall's logic was simple. The one who gets hit and doesn't respond has surrendered. The one who surrenders is owned. The one who owns rules. But Hana didn't respond, and she didn't surrender. That shattered the core rule of the prison. In the yard, while the sun climbed pale and thin, Hana walked her usual loop. Her steps were light, measured as if moving to a rhythm only she could hear. Her breathing was steady. It wasn't the kind of exercise that showed strength. It showed discipline. Some inmates began to notice. This wasn't weakness, it was training. Marla, sitting near the wall, tried to decipher it. Her power didn't come from brutality, it came from strategy. That's what made her a leader. Leaders identify threats before they grow, but Hana didn't present herself as a threat. She didn't stare people down, didn't claim space, didn't gather followers, and somehow she was influencing anyway. Later in the workroom, as women folded uniforms for distribution, two inmates whispered quietly enough to avoid attention. They didn't insult Marla or praise Hana. They talked about the choice they knew they would soon be forced to make. In Redwall, neutrality never lasted long. Everyone eventually chose a side. And that's when the conflict really began to take shape. When the supervisor announced a reorganization of dorm assignments, a wave of tension rippled across the room. Reassignments meant new living dynamics, new alliances, new fractures. It meant relationships could shift overnight. Hana was placed in the same dorm block as Marla. It wasn't an accident. Nothing in Redwall happened by accident. Whether the decision came from a guard, a bureaucratic reshuffle, or a quiet suggestion from someone who watched too closely, the result was the same. Both women would now share the same space when the lights went out, when silence revealed what daylight concealed. When Hana entered the dorm, the room fell quiet. The air felt thick. Marla sat on her bunk, sharpening her gaze like a blade no one could see. Hana walked to her bed. No hesitation. No one spoke. The lights turned off. And in the darkness, there was no confrontation. Something far more dangerous happened instead. Thought. Hana didn't fall asleep quickly. Her breathing stayed even, trained, controlled. Marla, lying in the upper bunk, didn't sleep either. Her breathing was heavy, weighted with feelings she didn't know how to name. When you fear what you see, you fight it. When you fear what you don't understand, you watch it. And when you watch too long, something inside you begins to unravel. The next day, the cafeteria was even quieter, not with tension, but with curiosity. Who was Hana? Where did that calm come from? And why, in a prison built entirely on power, was a woman with no visible strength causing a seasoned leader to hesitate? All of Redwall was now breathing in sync with that question. This is how real conflict begins, not when two people clash, but when one forces the other to think. Hana never returned the punch, but somehow she was winning. When a social structure shifts, it never shifts only at the top. It cracks in tiny places all along the foundation, in the whispered conversations, in the glances that used to dart away and now linger, in gestures that suddenly carry new meaning. That's exactly what began happening in Redwall. The tension between Marla and Hannah was no longer just a silent standoff between two women. It had become a mirror, reflecting the fears, fractures, and unspoken histories of everyone trapped inside those walls. Among the inmates watching, two women in particular began to stand out. The first was Nia, one of the newer arrivals. She had cropped hair and eyes that were always sharply alert, like someone who hadn't yet lost the ability to be surprised. She watched everything, absorbed everything, but spoke almost never. At first, she had gravitated toward Marla, not out of admiration, but pure survival instinct. But after seeing what happened in the cafeteria, something shifted in her. Not rebellion, recognition. The second was Rosa, older, practically a quiet institution within Redwall. She had survived there for years, without entangling herself in power plays. She had seen leaders rise and collapse. She had witnessed calculated betrayals and alliances that dissolved overnight. Rosa believed everything eventually repeats, but Hannah stirred something she hadn't seen in a long time. True mystery. Rosa was the kind of woman who could read a whole life in someone's eyes, and in Hannah's she saw history, discipline, tightly contained pain, and purpose. That was the problem. Purpose can't be broken with intimidation. Meanwhile, in the guards' administrative hallways, a file number began circulating in hushed tones, Archive 72H. It was tied to Hannah's record. Nobody knew exactly what was inside it, only that parts of the file had been sealed by a federal agency before her transfer. Whenever that happened, it meant the story ran deeper than the paperwork. And Redwall, true to its nature, reacted to the unknown the worst way possible: speculation. Some inmates whispered that Hannah had been military. Others believed she was connected to a witness protection case and was staying silent to avoid drawing attention. There were even those who thought she was in the prison by mistake, an idea that sounded impossible, but that only made it more compelling. Marla heard the rumors. She missed nothing. And the more she heard, the more uneasy she became. Because her power wasn't built only on strength, it was built on predictability. She needed to know exactly what to expect from everyone around her. That was how she measured danger, and Hannah could not be measured. That unpredictability seeped into the dorm at night. The silence wasn't restful. It was watchful, heavy. It hung in the air between bunks like fog waiting to reveal something. Nia found herself studying Hannah from across the yard and dining hall, trying to decode her. Why did she walk the same route in the yard every day? Why did she eat at the same pace? Why were her movements so exact, so spare, as if every gesture was part of an invisible training regimen? And most of all, how did she remain whole in a place designed to break people from the inside out? Rosa didn't watch with curiosity. She watched with understanding. She recognized silent pain. She recognized someone who had already faced something larger than any prison could hold. And Rosa knew, because she had seen it once before, that people like that weren't threats to maintain power. They were threats to change it. And nothing terrifies power more than transformation. Meanwhile, Marla tried to regain her footing, but something inside her had shifted. The punch she gave Hannah was no longer remembered as an act of control. It was remembered as the moment she lost it. A defeat isn't when you get knocked down. The worst defeat is realizing your first strike meant nothing, and that truth was beginning to rot Marla from the inside. Redwall waited, quiet and tense, for the next move. But no one knew who it would come from, and that uncertainty was, in itself, the beginning of the real war. The turning point didn't begin with a fight. There were no shouts, no bodies hitting the floor, no burst of rage. It began, ironically, with silence again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of humiliation in the cafeteria. It was a different silence, one of collective observation, of held breath, of everyone waiting. It happened during morning inspection. The inmates stood lined up in the yard, perfectly straight rows stretching across the concrete. The early sun bleached the ground nearly white, and guards paced slowly between them, checking for anything out of place. It was routine, and in Redwall, routine rarely produced surprises. Until that day, Marla stood in the front row, as always, back straight, eyes forward, expression unshakable. Hannah was a few rows behind, calm, relaxed, face composed. Nothing looked different. Nothing suggested anything was about to break. But there was something new in the air. Eyes that once belonged entirely to Marla were now divided. Not loyalty, not defiance, doubt, and doubt is the first crack that brings down a wall. When the guard in charge ended inspection, the rows were released to head toward the cafeteria. But before they could move, a voice boomed across the yard. "Briggs! Warden's office! Now!" Simple words, spoken flat, but they hit like an earthquake, because no one got called to the warden without reason. Marla turned slowly. Her face didn't change, but the yard did. The inmates could smell the shift. She walked out, not hesitating, her step steady. But the space she left behind felt unstable. Her power wasn't just in her presence, it was in her constancy. Stepping away, even for minutes, created openings that were too wide. When the office door closed behind her, an invisible tension settled over the yard. No one spoke, but everyone thought the same unspoken thing. If Marla doesn't come back the same, then who runs this place now? Rosa watched Hannah, Nia watched Rosa, and Hannah watched the wind move across the fence line. When Marla eventually returned, there were no marks, no visible signs of consequence, and yet the entire prison knew immediately. Something had shifted. Her walk was still firm, but it no longer weighed the same. The certainty she carried in her shoulders was thinner, barely noticeable, but real. Something had been taken. Not power, stability, and that was the real shift. In the cafeteria later, as Marla moved through the aisle of tables, no one looked away. And for the first time in years, some didn't lower their heads. This wasn't rebellion, it was awareness. Marla stopped beside Hannah again. Same place, same table, same scene, but nothing about it was the same. Hannah ate with the same steady calm. Marla placed her hand on the table, not to threaten, just to assert she was still here. Her voice wasn't harsh this time. It wasn't sharp. It came quiet, waited. "You want something in here?" Hannah lifted her eyes, for the first time. That was the moment Redwall changed, because her eyes held no fear, no challenge, no resentment. They held clarity. "I'm not here to take anything from anyone," Hannah said. A simple sentence. But in Redwall, it meant everything. It took Marla a few seconds to understand what that meant. If Hannah didn't want power, then her strength didn't depend on anyone here, which meant she couldn't be controlled. And what cannot be controlled is the greatest threat of all in a place ruled by fear. The cafeteria saw it, felt it, recorded it. Marla stepped back. Not far, not enough to call it surrender, just enough for everyone to notice. And sometimes, half a step is all it takes for an empire to begin to fall. From that moment on, the question was no longer who was stronger, it was who could not be broken. Hannah didn't rule Redwall, but Redwall began to revolve around her. Not because she tried, but because she didn't need to. Marla sat at the far table. Hannah continued eating, steady and quiet, and just like that, so slight it could have gone unseen, the invisible structure of the prison rewrote itself. The women who once followed Marla now looked at Hannah, not as a leader, but as something far rarer in that place, someone who had not lost herself. And that was the real turning point, not a fight, not a scream, not a blow, But the day fear changed direction. The change didn't happen overnight. Real change, especially in a place like Redwall, happens in small gestures, lingering glances, and silences that suddenly mean something. After the cafeteria, after Marla's half-step back, the atmosphere of the prison shifted, not explosive but alert, not chaotic but unsettled. A new kind of silence settled in, not the silence of fear, but of calculation. The inmates who once followed Marla out of instinct were now watching Hana from a distance, trying to understand a different kind of power. They weren't ready to switch allegiance, but they were ready to consider it, and that alone was dangerous. Marla felt it before anyone else. She felt it where power always registers first, in the eyes of others. When she walked across the yard, no one avoided her, but no one rushed to acknowledge her either. The ground beneath her wasn't gone, it had simply shifted, still there, but unstable. And for the first time, she felt pressure to prove herself, not to the others, to herself. Meanwhile, Hana remained exactly the same. No alliances, no influence plays, no changes in routine. That steadiness, that unshakable internal rhythm, became the most noticeable thing about her. Redwall was a place designed to fracture people from the inside out, yet Hana remained whole, and everyone wanted to know why. In the dorm, Rosa watched quietly. She understood before anyone else what was actually happening. Marla wasn't losing power, she was losing certainty. And when a leader built on control loses certainty, the power slips through her fingers. Naya, on the other hand, watched everything with growing unrest. She didn't know whether she admired Hana or feared what would come next. Because, as life had already taught her, every shift has a cost, and no one yet knew who would pay it. The guards noticed too, not because they cared about inmate politics, but because any collective behavioral shift meant potential conflict. And conflict meant paperwork, supervision, investigations. One guard, Officer Turner, watched Hana with practiced focus. She recognized trained discipline when she saw it. Hana's control didn't come from chance. The question was no longer, why didn't Hana fear Marla? The question now was, where did Hana come from? Marla began to act differently. She didn't confront. She didn't threaten. She didn't try to reassert dominance through force. She observed. And observation, for her, was the first step towards strategy. If fear could no longer control the room, she needed information. She needed to understand. But Hana was a book with no pages. One afternoon in the laundry room, Nia finally found the courage to speak to Hana. It wasn't planned, it was just human. "Why didn't you react that day?" she asked, folding sheets. Hana didn't answer right away. She finished what she was doing, placed the fabric in the cart, took a slow breath. "Because there was nothing to react to," she said. Nia frowned. "But she hit you." Hana looked toward the reinforced window, where the sky always seemed farther away than it should be. "Only what still holds power over us can strike us." Nia didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too busy realizing something. Hana wasn't strong because she won. She was strong because she had nothing left to prove. And that was the exact opposite of Marla. As the day passed, the story of Marla being called to the warden's office spread. The theories multiplied, internal investigations, privilege revocation, the guards getting tired of her. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. The rumor itself was enough to tilt the balance further. That night the dorm was quiet but heavy. Marla sat on her bunk, perfectly still. Hana lay down, breathing slow. Rosa watched. Nia couldn't close her eyes. And in that thick quiet, they all understood. The next confrontation wouldn't be physical. It would be between the one still trying to prove her strength and the one who no longer needed to. And Redwall was about to choose who to follow. Redwall was a place built to erase identities. Inside those walls, the past didn't matter, names didn't matter, dreams didn't matter. The prison didn't want anyone to remember who they once were. It wanted everyone to accept who they were now. Even so, There were people who, after years inside, still held on to a thin thread of memory, a quiet reminder that whispered, "I exist beyond this." Hana was one of those people. In the days that followed, her presence took on a new meaning. Even though she never said anything, she wasn't a leader, she didn't seek followers, she didn't preach or posture. She simply continued being what she already was, unwavering. And in its own way, that consistency began to teach silently a lesson no speech could have delivered. Nia was the first to feel it. Once anxious, always braced for impact, always preparing for the worst, she began experiencing something unfamiliar. Pause. Being near Hana felt like stepping into a space where the world didn't have to be decided by force, where you were allowed to exist at your own pace. Nia began walking the yard alongside Hana. It wasn't a partnership. It wasn't declared friendship. It was shared presence. And in Redwall, that was revolutionary. Rosa, however, understood something deeper. What surrounded Hana wasn't just calm. There was discipline, there was history, there was pain, processed, not hidden. And Rosa knew well, transformation like that never happens alone. One afternoon in the makeshift art room, where inmates painted to pass the time, Rosa sat beside Hana. Neither spoke at first. They shared silence because that was their language. When Rosa finally spoke, her voice barely carried. "Before this place, who were you?" Hana didn't rush to answer, not because she needed to think, but because she needed to choose words that wouldn't reopen wounds too wide. "Someone who learned not to break," she said. Rosa understood instantly. Pain has its own vocabulary. And that was a complete answer. Hana's growth wasn't physical. It was inward. It was the strength of someone who no longer needed to prove they deserved to exist. And that quiet strength began to touch others. In the cafeteria, two women who were often targets of petty intimidation began to change how they carried themselves. Not because Hana taught them anything, but because watching her exist without asking permission made them realize they could too. In the yard, where tension usually lived just beneath the skin, people began to breathe a little slower. Small conversations began to form, not about power or alliances, but about memories, about self. And there was nothing more threatening to a prison than people remembering they were still human. Meanwhile, Marla watched it all. She wasn't blind. She wasn't naive. She knew Hana wasn't trying to take her place, but she also knew something else. Power that isn't challenged doesn't need defending. The fact that she now felt challenged, even though Hana hadn't done a thing, revealed a truth she had never faced. Marla's strength came from the outside, from how others saw her. Hana's strength came from within, from how she saw herself. And strength that comes from within cannot be taken. That realization was the beginning of Marla's shift, not the kind others could see. A shift inside. For the first time, she asked herself what exactly she had been protecting all these years. Her title, her control, her image, or something older buried so long she had forgotten its shape. That night in the dorm, the silence was different. Not the silence of fear, the silence of reflection. Nia breathed deeply, feeling, perhaps for the first time, that she could belong in her own skin without defending it. Rosa lay awake, knowing she was witnessing something rare, change that begins within before it ever appears outward. Hana slept, steady and peaceful. And Marla, awake on the top bunk, did not feel anger. She felt something harder, something sharper, a mirror. Because if Hana could exist whole, despite everything, then maybe she could too. And that was the true beginning of healing. Not when one person defeats another, but when a person defeats the version of themselves they've been surviving behind. Redwall didn't know it yet. But that night marked the first time in a long time that two women, so different and yet so alike, were about to learn that real strength isn't about overpowering someone. It's about standing whole without needing to crush anyone to do it. Redwall felt like it was breathing differently that week. The routines were the same. Siren at 6 a.m., cafeteria at 7, yard at 9, workshop, showers, inspections, lockdown. The days still repeated themselves like cheap copies of the day before. But beneath that mechanical repetition, something quiet was rewriting itself. The way the women saw one another. Before, everything revolved around hierarchy and fear. Now, something new had taken root. Recognition. When one inmate looked at another, she no longer saw only an opponent or an ally. She saw a story, a scar, a memory. And in a place built to erase identity, that was dangerous. But it was also inevitable. Hana kept her routine. She walked the yard in slow, steady circles, as if syncing her thoughts with her breath. Her hands moved with a quiet precision, sometimes tracing motions that looked like echoes of something once practiced. Not a fight exactly, but a memory of training. Naya began mimicking the movements from a distance, not because she asked to be taught, but because the body learns what the mind finally feels safe enough to notice. It was learning by presence, the purest kind there is. Rosa watched everything the way someone watches weather patterns. She recognized this kind of calm, the kind that comes right before a storm rearranges the landscape, the moment when every piece finds its place. But it wasn't only the inmates who felt the shift. The guards had noticed too. Officer Turner, especially, had begun tracking Hana during shared hours. Not in a threatening way, but in the way someone tries to understand a puzzle. She saw discipline in every step, precision in every gesture, focus in every breath, and Turner knew the look of someone shaped by real training. This wasn't brute strength. This was internal regulation. Turner watched Marla as well, and slowly she recognized what many hadn't yet. Marla wasn't afraid of Hana. Marla was afraid of what she might become if she tried to defeat her. Meanwhile, the inmates began to subtly reorganize themselves. Nia no longer walked with her eyes glued to the ground. Two women who were usually pushed aside at meals now sat together without being moved. Even the cruel whispering tapered off. It wasn't unity, but it was humanity. And in Redwall, that was already a revolution. Yet beneath it all sat one shared fear. What if this was temporary? Nothing in prison stays stable for long. Whenever peace appears, something, or someone, always tries to pull the place back into violence, just to restore the old order. Everyone felt that something was coming. The tension crystallized the morning the warden changed the yard schedule, mixing all inmates together instead of separating them by unit. That never happened by accident. It was like releasing two currents into one river and waiting to see how the water would break. When the gates opened, everyone walked out. No one spoke. The silence wasn't fear, it was anticipation. Marla stood at the edge of the yard, her gaze heavier, more present, more human than before. Hana stood near the wall, back turned, breathing slow. Rosa chose a place where she could see both. Nia froze in place, unsure how to breathe. A few inmates stepped back, not out of fear, but out of respect. It was clear now. This was not about who would win. It was about who each woman would choose to be. The conflict between Hana and Marla had never been about territory or power. It had always been internal. Hana hadn't tried to take anything from anyone. But simply by existing, she had reminded Marla of something she had buried. Strength doesn't require hardness. Survival doesn't require aggression. Power doesn't require fear. For the first time in years, Marla was standing in front of the hardest choice anyone in Redwall could ever face. Continue ruling through fear, or accept that real power comes from within. And finally, rebuild herself. The yard was silent. The sun kept rising. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Something was about to happen, but none of them knew whether it would be a collapse or a rebirth. This was the moment right before the climax. The moment where every past decision meets the possibility of a different future. The moment where everything could change. The yard felt suspended in the air. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but there was enough light to outline the two figures at the center of everything. Hana, still breathing steadily. Marla, standing a few steps behind her, carrying a weight no one could see, but everyone could feel. Neither woman moved, and yet everything was happening. The metallic slam of the gate, closing behind the inmates, echoed across the yard. An invisible line formed between them, not a battle line, a truth line. Marla stepped forward. There was no rage in her eyes, no trace of the old ferocity that had long dictated the rhythm of the prison. What filled her expression was something deeper, harder to name. Exhaustion, not the kind that comes from the body, but the kind that comes from wearing armor for too many years. "You think you know what it means to survive?" Marla asked quietly, without aggression. Hana didn't answer. She simply turned her head to meet her gaze. It was the first time the two actually looked at each other. Marla continued, "I didn't choose this." She touched her chest. "Not the prison, not the yard herself. This is something I was forced to become." Hana didn't look away. Her eyes held compassion, but not pity. It was something different. Recognition. "I know," she said. The words cut through the yard as if shouted, because some women fight to control the world, others fight to avoid disappearing inside it. Marla exhaled, and for the first time anyone had ever seen, her breath trembled. "If I hadn't been the strongest, if I hadn't been the worst one in here, I would have been destroyed." She wasn't defending herself, she was telling the truth. Hana stepped forward, slow, soft, unthreatening. "You were strong for so long that you forgot you weren't born this way," she said. Marla's face wavered, but did not break. It wasn't weakness, it was honesty. And honesty, when spoken without violence, can disarm more effectively than force. The entire yard was silent, but not with fear now, with listening. Marla looked around, at the walls, the steel, the faces of the women who had followed her, feared her, depended on her, at everything she had built and everything it had cost. "If I let this go," she whispered, voice trembling, "what's left of me?" Hana stepped close, just close enough. "You," she said, "only you. No speeches, no heroics, just truth." And in Redwall, truth was rarer than freedom. Marla lowered her head for the first time in years, not in surrender, in release. She breathed deeply, as if something long buried finally loosened its grip on her ribs. Hana lifted her hand, not to touch, just to be there. Marla looked at her and understood. What happened wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't alliance, it wasn't friendship, it was recognition. Recognition between two women who survived the world differently, yet somehow arrived in the same place. The moment when fighting everything stops making sense and fighting for yourself begins. Marla stepped back, gently, not enough to signify defeat, just enough to signify choice. And it was the most powerful moment Redwall had seen in years, because sometimes the climax isn't when someone wins, it's when someone decides to stop losing themselves. In that yard, surrounded by women who had learned to bury every soft thing they had left, a once feared leader and an unbreakable woman showed everyone something unheard of. Survival doesn't have to cost your humanity. In that moment, the entire prison breathed as one, not because Hana defeated Marla, but because Marla finally found herself again. And Redwall was never the same after that. In the days that followed, Redwall didn't look any different. The walls were still high, the routines still strict, the doors still closed with the same cold metal echo. But everyone who lived there knew the prison was no longer the same. Marla didn't lose her place, and Hana didn't try to take anything that wasn't hers. There was no shift of power, no dramatic fall. What happened was something quieter, rarer, and far more transformative. A pause in the invisible war every woman there fought inside herself. Marla was still respected, but not out of fear anymore. The women who once lowered their eyes around her now met her gaze, not to challenge her, but to acknowledge her, to recognize that she too carried scars. She didn't become weaker, she became human. And inside a prison, that is a strength only a few ever learn to hold. Hana remained the same. She didn't turn into a leader. She didn't become a symbol or a voice of resistance. She simply continued her routine, walking lightly in the yard, breathing slow and deep, eating without rush, looking up at the sky whenever she felt the need. But now, those small gestures were no longer just noticed. They were absorbed. Some women began to mirror her movements. Others allowed themselves to feel again. One started writing in an old notebook. Another, who used to sleep tense every night, began sleeping deeply for the first time in years. It was subtle, but it was real. Rosa, who had always been able to see what others missed, understood what was happening. Hana didn't change Redwall. She reminded Redwall that change was still possible. Nia, calmer now, walked beside her without needing to think ahead, without bracing for what might come. She learned to breathe again, to live in her own body again, to exist without apologizing for existing. Between Hana and Mala, nothing needed to be said. There was no alliance, no rivalry. There was respect. When they passed each other in the hallway, a small nod was enough. When they shared the cafeteria, silence was enough. Each followed her own path, and for the first time, those paths did not have to collide to be recognized. Inside Redwall, where the world had tried to erase so many stories, two women proved something that can't be taught, only revealed. True strength doesn't belong to the one who dominates. It belongs to the one who remains whole when the world tries to break them from the inside out. And that was how the prison changed, not because someone won, but because no one needed to win to survive. Months later, a new group of inmates arrived. Among them, a young girl, looking down, scared, shrinking into herself. Before the old rules could settle into place, Nia sat beside her in the cafeteria, offering space, not ownership. Hana walked the yard nearby. Marla watched quietly, understanding. Change is never a single moment. It's a movement. And now, Redwall breathed differently, not as a territory of fear, but as a place where, between concrete and pain, something rare had taken root: respect. If this story reached you, hold on to this. You don't know what someone else is fighting inside. Sometimes the greatest strength is staying yourself, even when the world tries to break you. If you want more stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below, "I remain whole." It helps this message reach someone who needs it. Share this with someone you care about, and stay with me. Every story from here is a new beginning.